Russia stands at a breaking point, a nation whose once quiet obedience has begun to fracture under unbearable strain. The silence that long defined public life is fading, replaced by a growing chorus of defiance and fatigue. Across Moscow and St. Petersburg, political elites are trying to project calm, but their control is eroding as dissent seeps outward from the cities to the peripheries. What began as scattered whispers among journalists and local deputies has evolved into something unprecedented: open calls for Vladimir Putin to resign. The spark came not from the front lines of Ukraine, but from the kitchen tables of ordinary Russians. Soaring prices, empty fuel stations, and a crumbling welfare system have made the war personal. Every loaf of bread, every missing liter of gasoline, every unpaid pension now feels like a tax for a conflict that many no longer believe in. This is the social fracture where economic survival becomes an act of resistance. Once loyal supporters, including figures such as Dmitry Shechin, the editor of Komsomolskaya Pravda, are publicly warning that if these issues remain unresolved, the regime itself may collapse. Even more symbolically, local councils' institutions, once fully loyal to Moscow, are taking risks unthinkable just 2 years ago. In St. Petersburg's Smolninskoye district council members filed an official petition to the State Duma accusing Putin of treason for the war in Ukraine. It was not a liberal protest, but a bureaucratic rebellion, a challenge wrapped in legal precision. They argued that Putin's decisions had destroyed the army, triggered demographic collapse, wrecked the economy, and isolated Russia strategically. Though they knew the Duma would ignore their appeal, they succeeded in breaking the Kremlin's most sacred taboo, questioning the leader himself. This political act resonated far beyond the urban elite. In the rural republics, Buryatia, Dagestan, and Tuva, where young men are sent to die at rates up to 5 times higher than in Moscow, resentment runs deeper. According to an analysis by BBC Russian Service and Media Zona, the per capita death toll in Buryatia is among the highest in the country. In these regions, the war has become a symbol of exploitation, the center's prosperity built on the sacrifice of the periphery. It is no longer viewed as a patriotic mission, but as a cruel lottery rigged against the poor. Mothers in Ulan-Ude bury their sons while Moscow's cafes remain full. The inequality between Russia's regions has turned the war into a class and ethnic conflict. Fuel shortages hit the countryside first, and food inflation there is double the rate of the cities. As the Kremlin diverts funds to military production schools in villages close, and hospitals operate without heating oil. Yet the propaganda on national television speaks of victory near, as if the suffering of the rural poor were a distant rumor. This contrast between televised triumph and lived despair fuels the moral disintegration of Putin's social base. Independent polling from the Levada Center and international observers like the Journal of Democracy reveal the scale of this transformation. Today, over 57% of Russians support peace negotiations, while only 35% want the war to continue. These numbers carry an existential meaning. Peace is now equated with Putin's departure. Behind the statistics lies a human story, one of stolen futures and quiet rebellion. Putin's rule once relied on stability and prosperity. Now both have collapsed. Public patience, once sustained by oil money and patriotic spectacle, has evaporated. The Kremlin's narrative of a besieged Russia defending its civilization no longer convinces the mother waiting in line for heating fuel or the pensioner counting rubles at a frozen bus stop. This is the beginning of a deeper fracture, a social awakening masked as desperation. And yet the regime shows no intention of listening. Instead of aid, it sends propaganda. Instead of reform, repression. But fear has diminishing returns. As Reuters recently reported, regional governors are quietly warning the Kremlin that economic collapse could trigger uncontrollable unrest by winter. The question haunting the corridors of power is not whether dissent exists, it is how long the state can suppress it without imploding from within. In this widening gap between ruler and ruled, Russia's greatest threat is no longer on the battlefield, it is at home. Each protest, each petition, each whispered conversation chips away at the myth of an unshakable leader. The system that once demanded absolute loyalty is now rotting under its own weight. Across Russia's vast landscape, daily life has become a test of endurance. The nation's economic collapse is no longer a forecast. It is a lived reality unfolding in every supermarket, gas station, and pension office. What began as shortages in distant regions has now reached the heart of the country. Even in Moscow, once insulated from hardship, people queue for fuel and pay inflated prices for basics like bread, milk, and oil. The social contract that once exchanged political silence for economic comfort has shattered. Nowhere is this clearer than in the fuel crisis that has paralyzed entire regions. In Nizhny Novgorod, drivers wait hours for gasoline that never comes. In the Perevozhsky district, school buses have stopped running. Children stay home not because of snow or strikes, but because there is no fuel left to take them to class. Crimea, which the Kremlin once paraded as its proudest conquest, now faces empty gas stations, half of them shut down completely. The Moscow Times recently reported that 2.6% of all gas stations nationwide have run dry, and that number rises daily. For millions, the special military operation has turned into a domestic siege. This shortage is not a local mishap, but a symptom of a broken system. The war has drained the treasury and redirected fuel to the front lines. Even heating oil for rural hospitals and schools has been rationed. In some provinces, fuel is reserved exclusively for government and security vehicles, the clearest sign that the state now prioritizes control over comfort. The Kremlin claims the crisis is temporary, yet experts at Defense News warn that sanctions on oil exports and logistical disruptions from Ukrainian drone strikes on refineries have permanently weakened Russia's fuel infrastructure. The economic toll extends beyond fuel. Inflation has eaten away at every ruble. Supermarket shelves, once filled with local produce, now display imported goods at twice the price. Pharmacies are empty not because of hoarding, but because foreign suppliers refuse to deal with sanctioned banks. The most vulnerable are those who once relied on state pensions. In 2025, the Kremlin quietly raided the Social Assistance Fund, withdrawing $4.8 billion to finance the war effort. The result: delayed pensions, slashed payments, and shattered trust. For many elderly Russians who endured Soviet collapse and post-1990s chaos, this betrayal cuts deepest. Here lies the social injustice at the core of the current crisis. The burden of war is borne by those who never chose it: pensioners, workers, and provincial families. The rich elite of Moscow remain shielded by privilege, while the rural poor pay with hunger and humiliation. The Kremlin's decision to raise the value-added tax from 20% to 22%, a move confirmed by Reuters, is the final insult. It is a wartime tax disguised as fiscal policy, forcing every Russian to contribute directly to the bombs falling on Ukraine. This is a tax on the poor, warned Alexander Shokin of the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, because they spend everything they earn. Through the social lens, the state's betrayal is more than economic, it is moral. Russia's leadership has weaponized taxation and inflation to extract loyalty through survival. Every loaf of bread, every liter of fuel, every bottle of medicine is now a political act. When citizens can no longer afford to live, even silence becomes rebellion. Meanwhile, local journalists and economists, many now writing anonymously on Telegram to avoid arrest, describe a country running on fumes. Public services are collapsing under debt. Teachers are paid late. Hospitals use outdated Soviet machines. Rural clinics, already understaffed, are closing in droves. The Kremlin's televised optimism feels obscene against this backdrop. And yet, this decay is not hidden from the world. International media, BBC, Al Jazeera, The Guardian report that Russia's internal economy has shrunk by more than 8% since 2022 despite official claims of growth. The ruble's value has halved since the invasion, and with oil revenues diverted to military spending, regional budgets are disintegrating. Inside Russia, the silence of ordinary people is no longer compliance. It is exhaustion. Fear has been replaced by fatigue. In kitchens and factories, people whisper about how long they can hold out. In the countryside, where graves for fallen soldiers multiply beside shuttered schools, the cost of the war has become unavoidably clear. The Kremlin may still control the narrative on television, but the truth is written in empty wallets and cold apartments. The illusion of normalcy of a Russia united behind its leader has cracked. The government has failed to protect the most basic needs of its people. What remains is a nation where the struggle for heat, food, and dignity defines every day, and where the first sparks of rebellion are lit not by politics, but by hunger. In a country haunted by the ghosts of its own history, Russia's youth now face a grim inheritance, a future sacrificed to sustain a war they never chose. The Kremlin calls them patriots. Their mothers call them missing. The scale of this human drain is staggering. Since the first mobilization in 2022, more than 700,000 young Russians have fled the country, seeking refuge in Georgia, Kazakhstan, Armenia, and the European Union. The regime brands them cowards, yet their departure reveals the truth. The nation's brightest minds no longer believe in its future. This is the demographic fracture, the slow bleeding of a generation. Every death on the battlefield and every plane ticket abroad represents a wound in Russia's long-term survival. According to BBC and Medusa investigations, over 1 million Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded since the war began. Most are under 35. Entire villages in Buryatia and Dagestan are losing their male population, while cities like Moscow continue to thrive economically. The war has become an arithmetic of injustice. The poorer and more remote your region, the higher the chance your son will not return. The Kremlin avoids calling it a mobilization. Instead, it hides behind euphemisms, volunteer contracts, temporary deployment, patriotic duty. But reports from Reuters and Novaya Gazeta Europe confirm what many already know: Russia is conducting a covert second wave of mobilization. Convicts, debtors, and unemployed men are being coerced into signing contracts with promises of cash and amnesty. It is a manhunt masked as recruitment. Soldiers are told they will defend Russia's borders only to be sent deep into Ukraine's industrial zones or near Kharkiv, where losses are highest. The social perspective deepens this tragedy. Ethnic minorities bear the heaviest burden. In the Siberian republics, mothers hang portraits of fallen sons on the walls of local schools, not as heroes, but as reminders of a silent genocide of the poor. In Dagestan, public mourning has become an act of defiance. Women dressed in black stand outside government buildings demanding news of their husbands and sons. Videos of these protests, shared on Telegram and picked up by Al Jazeera, have become symbols of resistance that the Kremlin cannot easily crush. These women are not political activists. They are grieving mothers who expose the hypocrisy of a government claiming to protect traditional family values while destroying its own families. This moral uprising represents a political crack in Putin's armor. For decades, the regime relied on women's passivity as a pillar of social control. Today, that foundation is gone. The Soldiers' Mothers movement, which once supported the government during the Chechen wars, has re-emerged as a moral force, organizing across regions through encrypted chats and community networks. They spread information about casualties, expose military corruption, and offer emotional support to those who refuse to send their sons. These women are rewriting the language of protest in Russia, soft in tone but unyielding in message. Meanwhile, those who stay behind live in fear of the next draft. University students report being followed by recruiters. Small businesses receive quotas for volunteer recommendations. In some cases, as The Guardian revealed, even the mentally ill are being pressured to enlist. This erosion of consent, replacing patriotism with coercion, has transformed the war from a national mission into a national wound. But perhaps the most devastating cost is invisible: the brain drain. Since 2022, more than 1 million skilled professionals, engineers, programmers, scientists have left Russia. According to the Atlantic Council, this is the largest outflow of talent since the fall of the Soviet Union. Entire tech companies have relocated to Kazakhstan and Armenia. Universities report declining enrollment, and major research institutions are losing professors to exile. What remains is a hollowed-out state, a government that can conscript soldiers but cannot inspire citizens. This exodus creates a generational burden that no propaganda can disguise. In 20 years, Russia will face a pension crisis, not because of Western sanctions, but because it has destroyed its own demographic foundation. The same young men dying in Ukraine were meant to sustain the labor force and support the elderly. With every coffin returned home, the country's future shrinks. Putin's government may still speak of destiny and empire, but beneath the slogans lies a population quietly disappearing. The war is not only eroding Russia's economy, it is erasing its people. A state that once boasted of rising from its knees now kneels before the demographic consequences of its own delusion. The collapse may not come from revolution, but from the slow extinction of those who might have carried the nation forward. The quiet rebellion has spread far beyond the capital, into towns and provinces that once voted unanimously for Putin. What began as political murmurs among local deputies has evolved into a network of discontent invisible to state television, but alive on Telegram and the streets. The regime's ability to control the peripheries, the vast territories that hold Russia together, is faltering. What Moscow fears most is happening: federal erosion, a slow unraveling of its authority from the outside in. In cities like Samara Perm and Novosibirsk, spontaneous protests have erupted not over ideology, but over survival, unpaid pensions, freezing apartments, and empty pharmacies. This is the new form of Russian resistance, the bread and heat protests. These gatherings lack political slogans or banners. They are fueled by exhaustion, not opposition. Yet they are far more dangerous to the Kremlin than the liberal rallies of Moscow's intelligentsia. When a mother stands in front of a local administration building demanding heating for her child's school, it's not politics, it's despair made public. From the political perspective, these local actions mark the beginning of decentralized defiance. Governors, mayors, and police chiefs are trapped between two forces: the Kremlin's pressure from above and public anger from below. Some local officials quietly refuse to enforce new tax increases or delay the collection of mobilization quotas, fearing riots. According to reports by BBC Russian Service and Novaya Gazeta, Europe, internal communications reveal growing friction between Moscow's ministries and regional administrations, especially in poorer republics. The war has drained not only budgets, but also obedience. Meanwhile, social media remains the regime's blind spot. Telegram V-Contact and even local chat groups have become digital protest squares, where citizens organize fuel-sharing share casualty lists and spread footage of corruption. The Medusa outlet recently described how micro-resistance networks, mostly women teachers and retirees, use coded language to evade censorship while documenting local failures. Each small act of communication is a breach in the wall of fear that Putin spent 2 decades constructing. From the social perspective, the regional divide has never been wider. The peripheries pay the blood price while Moscow lives in artificial prosperity. Reports from Reuters indicate that the death toll per capita in Buryatia, Tuva, and Dagestan is 5 to 7 times higher than in Moscow or St. Petersburg. The ethnic imbalance is stark. Young men from minority republics fill the coffins, while ethnic Russians from major cities fill government positions. This inequality is not only geographic, it's moral. A growing number of analysts from Al Jazeera to The Economist describe Russia's war as an imperial war turned inward, where the empire consumes its own subjects. These regional injustices have birthed new forms of soft resistance. In Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, local councils are defying federal economic directives. Some are refusing to allocate funds for new military recruitment centers, arguing that they violate local law. This quiet disobedience, rarely reported, but deeply symbolic, undermines the Kremlin's claim of unity. Each act of defiance, no matter how small, represents another thread pulled from the fabric of federal control. The demographic perspective amplifies the long-term danger. As war casualties rise and migration intensifies, Russia's smaller regions face depopulation. The Moscow Times notes that villages in Siberia and the Far East are already vanishing. Schools close for lack of children, hospitals merge due to staff shortages, and entire communities disappear into silence. When these regions collapse, the state loses not only territory, but legitimacy. A government that cannot sustain life outside its capital ceases to be a federation. It becomes an empire in retreat. The outward signs of collapse are subtle but spreading. Internal migration toward Moscow and Krasnodar has surged, creating overcrowded urban zones and leaving rural areas abandoned. The Kremlin's attempt to patch the pension deficit by imposing new taxes has only fueled anger. Truckers refuse to pay. Farmers stage slow road protests, blocking highways with tractors. The government labels them saboteurs, but their message is clear: the center no longer represents the nation. Western observers, including Reuters and Defense News, now warn that Russia's internal instability may soon outweigh the risks of the war itself. Local economies are imploding faster than the Kremlin can print money. Factories dependent on Western components have shut down, while corruption diverts aid from Moscow before it reaches the provinces. Russia's leadership once prided itself on its ability to absorb pain, to survive chaos, and rebuild order. But this time, the chaos is not imported from abroad. It is homegrown, driven by hunger, exhaustion, and betrayal. The government's control may remain strong in Moscow, but beyond the ring road, authority dissolves into rumor and resentment. A state that can no longer heat its schools or fuel its buses is not powerful. It is hollow. And as winter approaches, the rebellion of the silent, the mothers, pensioners, and farmers, threatens to become the most dangerous uprising of all, one that demands nothing but the right to live. When the Kremlin senses instability, it always turns to its old arsenal: repression, propaganda, and bribery. These 3 instruments of control once defined Putin's mastery of crisis management. Yet in 2025, their edges have dulled. The iron fist that once inspired fear now meets a population that has already lost everything. The propaganda machine speaks to a country that no longer believes. And the system of bribery runs on an economy whose coffers are nearly empty. What remains is a government clinging to techniques that no longer work. The first weapon, repression, is being wielded with renewed ferocity. Local deputies who called for Putin's resignation have been interrogated, while soldiers' mothers who marched for their missing sons faced detention. In St. Petersburg, one woman was arrested by 11 police officers for holding a small banner showing her son's mobilization date, nothing more. It was a scene documented by Medusa, and it captured the essence of Russia's decaying authoritarianism, overwhelming force against defenseless grief. New legislation introduced this summer expands the powers of the FSB and Rosgvardia, allowing the arrest of anyone accused of undermining wartime morale. Yet this repression backfires. As BBC News notes, fear loses its power once survival is already in question. A mother who has buried her son cannot be silenced by a prison threat. Her loss has already exceeded the state's reach. From the political perspective, these arrests are less about law and more about optics. Putin's government seeks to remind the elite that defiance carries a cost. But the machinery of punishment, once efficient, now faces its own cracks. Courts are overwhelmed, prisons overcrowded, and regional police forces are stretched thin managing basic order. Analysts at Reuters and The Guardian report growing reluctance among officers to enforce new decrees, especially outside major cities. Brutality is exhausting even its enforcers. The second instrument, propaganda, remains vast, but its credibility has eroded. For years, Russian state media thrived on the besieged fortress narrative, blaming every hardship on the West. But in 2025, that narrative feels hollow. The United States, under President Donald Trump, has recalibrated its rhetoric, condemning Moscow's actions, but avoiding the escalation of direct confrontation. This change has weakened the Kremlin's claim that it faces an existential Western threat. Meanwhile, the daily realities of Russian life contradict the glossy fiction of state television. Reuters recently reported that even loyal viewers are beginning to switch off. Surveys show trust in state media has dropped below 40%, its lowest in decades. The stories of triumph ring false against a backdrop of hunger and cold. Desperate to redirect anger, the Kremlin has begun scapegoating its own bureaucrats. A wave of anti-corruption trials targets mid-level governors and generals accused of mishandling funds, a cynical attempt to feed public outrage without touching the top. But such sacrifices fool no one. As Al Jazeera notes, citizens recognize the pattern: when the state arrests one official, it is not justice, it is theater. The third and final tool, bribery, once held the empire together. Regional elites were rewarded for loyalty, soldiers paid bonuses, pensioners granted temporary subsidies. But that system depended on oil wealth, and the well is drying up. The Ministry of Finance admits a growing budget shortfall as oil exports fall due to sanctions and sabotage. Defense News revealed that several key arms manufacturers missed payrolls for the first time in over a decade, leading to silent strikes. Even military contractors, once the regime's most loyal beneficiaries, now demand back pay. Loyalty, it turns out, is expensive. From the social perspective, these failing strategies deepen inequality. Urban elites continue to receive benefits and exemptions, while provincial families face austerity. The state's attempt to buy obedience with selective generosity only widens the divide. Teachers in Bryansk go unpaid, while state TV hosts in Moscow receive million-ruble contracts. This moral corruption corrodes whatever remains of public trust. And from the demographic perspective, repression and propaganda cannot stop the bleeding. A regime that jails mothers and censors truth only drives more young people abroad. The Levada Center reports that 60% of Russians under 30 now wish to emigrate, a record high. This is not a protest movement in the streets, but a protest by departure. Each emigrant takes with them the country's future potential, its engineers, scientists, and artists. Putin's three weapons once ensured survival through control. Now they only delay collapse. The iron fist can imprison protesters, but not refill gas stations. Propaganda can invent victories, but not rebuild bridges. Bribery can buy silence, but not belief. In the face of material decay and moral exhaustion, the tools of autocracy are becoming relics of a dying system. What was once strength has turned into paralysis, the state striking out at shadows, unable to stop its own unraveling. Russia's slow-motion collapse no longer feels like speculation. It feels inevitable. The evidence is everywhere, in the broken fuel pumps, in the empty classrooms, in the quiet anger of families whose sons will never return. What began as a war of conquest has transformed into a war of erosion, grinding away the country's resources, people, and faith in leadership. The Kremlin still pretends to control events, yet even its loyalists admit privately that the empire's center of gravity is slipping away. From the political perspective, Putin's strategy has devolved into survival, not governance. His speeches grow shorter, his circle tighter, and his reliance on security agencies absolute. State television shows him surrounded by generals and priests, but not by citizens. The image of unity conceals a fractured elite struggling to agree on how to navigate a war that cannot be won or ended without humiliation. Leaks from within the presidential administration, reported by Reuters and Medusa, describe mounting disputes between military hardliners and economic technocrats. The former demand escalation. The latter warn that Russia is nearing financial collapse. Putin balances these factions through fear and patronage, but each day the balance tilts closer to chaos. The social perspective exposes a more tragic reality. Ordinary Russians are trapped in a cycle of suffering that no propaganda can justify. The average monthly wage now buys less than half of what it did before the war. Prices for staples, bread, oil, sugar rise weekly, while the value of the ruble sinks. Public opinion data from Levada Center shows declining trust, not just in government, but in the concept of the state itself. People still fear authority, but they no longer believe it serves them. In provincial towns, resentment has turned inward, targeting not only the Kremlin, but anyone perceived to benefit from its system: wealthy bureaucrats, media figures, military contractors. It is the psychology of a society devouring itself. The demographic perspective makes the future look even bleaker. Russia's population is shrinking faster than at any time since World War II. The UN Population Division now projects that by 2050, Russia's population could fall below 130 million, a decline driven not by natural causes, but by policy choices. Each year of war accelerates the loss. Birth rates have dropped by 8%, while male mortality in military age groups continues to rise. The country's median age is climbing, its workforce shrinking, and its pension system collapsing under the weight of war expenditures. Economists from the Economist Intelligence Unit warn that this demographic sinkhole will cripple Russia's industrial recovery for decades. The government's own attempt to encourage childbirth through one-time motherhood bonuses has failed, as young couples simply cannot afford families. Even within the elite, the mood has shifted from triumph to quiet panic. Oligarchs, once protected by proximity to power, now find themselves targets of suspicion. Several have fled to Dubai or Istanbul, fearing nationalizations and arrests. A few who remained, like billionaire Oleg Deripaska, have cautiously criticized the economic direction, warning that Russia risks becoming ungovernable. Al Jazeera noted that these murmurs, though subdued, reveal the elite's awareness that Putin's system built on oil obedience and fear is no longer sustainable. Internationally, Russia's isolation has deepened. Western sanctions have become permanent features of its economy, and the once coveted partnerships with China and India have cooled. Both nations continue to buy Russian energy, but at steep discounts, draining Moscow's leverage. President Donald Trump's administration has maintained sanctions, but avoided direct escalation, prioritizing domestic interests over European diplomacy. This pragmatic American stance leaves Russia in limbo, punished enough to hurt, ignored enough to fester. Putin, once a global power broker, is now a cornered autocrat whose threats ring hollow. Domestically, despair breeds migration. According to BBC and the Moscow Times, nearly 1.3 million Russians have left since 2022, forming a new diaspora of exiles, young, educated, and determined never to return. The loss of this generation is Russia's greatest strategic defeat, one that no battlefield victory could ever offset. These are the minds that would have modernized the nation's industries, universities, and cultural institutions. Their departure ensures that even if the guns fall silent tomorrow, Russia will face decades of stagnation. So can Putin still reverse the collapse? The evidence suggests otherwise. His control mechanisms are intact, but hollow, his institutions obedient but brittle. Every effort to suppress dissent only multiplies discontent. Every attempt to buy loyalty only exposes how little remains to give. As Defense News recently argued, Russia's greatest enemy is not Ukraine nor the West. It is entropy, the slow decay of its own political and economic order. The Kremlin may continue to rule through spectacle parades, televised decrees, patriotic anniversaries, but its foundations are eroding. Power in Russia once flowed from fear. Now it leaks through fatigue. The people are not revolting, but they are no longer participating. And that quiet withdrawal of trust, labor, and belief is how nations truly collapse. Whether history will mark this as a revolution or a slow implosion remains uncertain. But one truth is beyond doubt. The war that was meant to secure Putin's legacy has instead sealed his fate. Russia is not falling to an external enemy, but to the weight of its own contradictions. Russia stands on the brink of a historic unraveling. The war in Ukraine has not only drained its treasury, but hollowed out the very foundations of its society, its youth, its faith, and its will to endure. From fuel shortages to pension cuts, every crisis now feeds into a wider pattern of collapse. The poor and ethnic minorities bear the human cost. Mothers lead protests that challenge the Kremlin's silence, and a generation of professionals leaves for exile. Politically, the regime survives through repression and illusion. Economically, it withers under sanctions and debt. The once feared propaganda machine now competes with hunger and truth. Under President Donald Trump's cautious foreign policy, the West watches but does not intervene, leaving Russia to consume itself. What remains is a vast, wounded state, still armed, still proud, but aging, shrinking, and bleeding out. History may remember this not as a sudden fall, but as the slow implosion of a power that mistook fear for